Okay, and if you're writing a little bit, just think of it this way, right? If you're only like getting rid of the options that don't work, at least you're doing something. But like the more, and this is no joke, the more that is written on the test, it seems like the higher the score. Does that make sense? In most cases, not in all, because there were outliers of people who didn't write anything or hardly anything on the test that still did well, and people that, you know, wrote a ton on the test that didn't do as well. Does that make sense? So, but when you look at the averages, that's where it falls. Okay, so manifest destiny, okay? In the election of 1840s, voters are pretty upset about the American economy as a result of Jackson's policies under Martin Van Buren, and so they're really looking for something different. They don't want that establishment. Americans have a tendency to do this, where they're like, hey, I don't like the way things are, so let's do something entirely different. Let's go with a new person. And so they look kind of for somebody who's the anti-Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren will run again, although he in the campaign is called Martin Van Ruin. And also they talk a lot about how Martin Van Buren really liked enjoying foreign wines. Because I guess that's really important. Like, you know, if you don't drink American wine, but you drink foreign wine. Yeah, because you're not supporting American business yet. William Henry Harrison, on the other hand, is a Whig president, or a Whig candidate. He believed very much in Henry Clay's American system. Remember, Bank of the United States, internal improvements, and tariffs. And he also, because he was kind of a political outlier to a certain extent, he's considered a log cabin president, so he's not somebody who comes from a great deal of wealth. He also, in campaigning, does something different than any other president has up to this point. He actually goes and campaigns by the people and goes to them. So he basically, like, creates this log cabin on wheels, I'm not joking, like, and then takes this log cabin on wheels to go around and, like, give speeches off the porch of this log cabin on wheels and parade it around to really sell the fact that I'm like a common man kind of a dude. With 78% of the eligible voters voting, they will largely then push through Harrison, and he will become president. Unfortunately, Harrison decides that he is going to give an inaugural address that lasts 2 hours in the rain, and he doesn't wear a coat or a hat, and then afterwards he goes to all these receptions that are pretty common after the inauguration, and he gets pneumonia. And despite them trying bleeding and trying suction cups and Native American healing remedies, like using live snakes to have the snakes like bite him, and then supposedly like the venom was supposed to like somehow counteract the pneumonia. Probs not. I mean, probably the bleeding and the snake venom and everything else did him no favors whatsoever at all. But ultimately, he will die 1 month later, and John Tyler will become president. So John Tyler becomes known as his ascendancy. He is one of few presidents to be able to come into that position of power, although we will see Tyler will go up for re-election. Underneath Tyler will largely focus on the idea of manifest destiny. Under the Monroe Doctrine, the idea was that the United States would not allow any new or British or European powers to come in and take any additional territory in the Americas. This does not stop the United States from trying to acquire new territory, though, whatsoever. The term manifest destiny is coined by a man by the name of John L. O'Sullivan. And O'Sullivan is pretty much a commentary historian. He writes in 1845, between 1845 and 1860. And so we'll begin talking about this. And it talks a lot about the dominant individualism that rises out of this term. Between the 40s and the 50s, the United States will expand to the Pacific and then ultimately into the Caribbean. We believe it is our divine mission to do so. Part of our expansion then will have to deal with What do we do with these territories now that we have them? Will they become slave or free? Under the 3630, that line stops right here. So if we go any more this way, slave or free will be a continual question. The other question and conflict that will come up is, what do we do with the American Indian people? So far, the practice we have done is to do what with the American Indian people?
Move them further out west.
Just push them further out west. Well, where are you going to move them to? Where are you going to boot them to if we go all the way to the west, right? So we see this increased conflict between the United States and the American Indian populations. Although keep in mind that the vast majority of the Indian wars don't occur until after the Civil War, okay? So we're going to see some overlapping content here between pre-Civil War, post-Civil War. Does that make sense? Okay, and then the Civil War kind of going on. That's affecting a lot of this other stuff too. It will also bring up the ideas of patriotism, this ideas of self-government, of natural rights. How do we expand that democracy that large and still maintain it? But it's not like there isn't people already there. Quite frankly, Spain controls most of the American Southwest and has pretty well incorporated in that area. We can see this through the Spanish mission system and the establishment of the Spanish mission system. And also we can see it through the incorporation of these Spanish words into our Anglo-American culture. So for example, even if we look at the naming of towns, there's a reason why so much of California is something else, like San Francisco or San Diego or San Antonio, not in California, but still same kind of concept, right?
Santa Cruz.
Santa Cruz, but the same concept, because the San all stands for
San Barbados.
saint, okay? Saint something. Does that make sense? And so we see that incorporation. We also see the incorporation in other Anglo words like terms like rodeo and broncos and like that cowboy kind of terminology that we're familiar with. What's that?
Spanish rodeo.
Yeah, all that stuff is all Spanish. Because cowboy culture is not an American thing. It's actually a Spanish culture that is adopted by the American West. Does that make sense? So it's not something we invented by any means whatsoever at all. In the north, most of that land is claimed by Britain. And of course, we still have the American Indians throughout that region as well. In the promotion of settling west, we can see kind of initially this idea of why settle into this territory as it is the great American desert. And so there's this question of whether or not we even move into that territory, and it really largely has to be sold to the American public. It's done so through the use of, quite frankly, elaborated or kind of over-embellished advertising of how this was America's Garden of Eden. The reality of it is settling the Great Plains states will be a very difficult process, and for some, and in some areas, it's almost next to impossible. In 1871, Horace Greeley will write a little post-early settlement, but still kind of reflects that same kind of ideology, in which he says, "Go west, young man." He says that in the West, although the living conditions are very rude and very difficult, he says, you can stay where you are and do as well as you can, familiar with the conditions and dexterity required for the efficient conservation of outdoor industry in a new country. Having mastered these, gather up your family and go west. Okay? And he urges Americans, since the only challenge that you will ever present yourself is if you actually move west. The other thing that really drives Americans west is the fact that between 18, did I go too fast?
Oh, I said gold.
Oh, okay. That's part of it. I don't know why that's overlapped like that. I apologize. That's weird. Okay, it's between 1837 and 1843, there is an economic depression in the United States as a result of the policies of Jackson, okay? And Martin Van Buren didn't help to make anything better. And so Americans are looking for some sort of greater opportunity. And so because of that, they need to find some other place. Between 1840 and 1860, over 250,000 people will make the trek westward, although numerous of them don't actually stay. In fact, lots of them will come back. What we typically think of is the experience of people traveling west along the Oregon Trail. How many of you played that game? I know, I'm probably getting a little old to where you haven't played Oregon Trail. And probably your version of Oregon Trail, way different than the version of Oregon Trail I played, because when I played it, you literally had a literal floppy disk, and you had a green screen, or black screen with green font, or black screen with orange font. Yeah, I know, I'm old. But either way, you died of dysentery, right? Or snake bite, or something else like that. Or, yeah, something happened, right, and you died. That's the basic premises of Oregon Trail. You probably died. But that imagery that we have in our mind, that is not something that really lasts past 1840, the 1840s. Does that make sense? Once we're post-Civil War, the vast majority of Americans are not settling via the Oregon Trail. In fact, the largest percentage of Americans do not go west on the Oregon Trail. They go west on railroads once the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So our kind of idyllic imagery of what happened is complete falsehood. This is false. Does that make sense? There are people that travel that way, but the vast majority don't. The journey itself was very difficult. The majority of people actually go out into Oregon between 42 and 43. It's a 5 to 6 month journey, and it's approximately 2,000 miles. Again, that land is claimed by Spain, Britain, and the United States, and was mostly occupied by Indians. So these individuals traveling out into this great unknown technically were leaving the United States. Okay? Over 25 years, though, after the beginning of the Oregon Trails and along the Oregon Trail, we will see more than 500,000 men, women, and children that will settle west as a result of it. But all of this territory, it's actually illegal for Americans to homestead that territory. In fact, it's illegal until 1846. Because it is outside of the United States. There are approximately 17 deaths per mile, so by no means was it an easy trek whatsoever at all. So when you play the game and it says you died of dysentery, well, you probably in reality would have, okay? 17 deaths per mile, that's a lot. Does that make sense? Okay. By 1846, though, that we have approximately 5,000 Americans that are settling south of the Columbia River in what is current-day Oregon. If we compare that to Great Britain, there's only about 700 British who are in that territory. So it's really much more Americans who are settling than people who are of British citizenship. Does that make sense? Okay. And so there begins this greater and greater call towards taking more of that occupation and more of that land. After we have the Oregon Trail, we will eventually figure out the route to California along the California Trail. Again, we're looking for settlement in places. At 1846, we have not yet discovered gold, so we are just looking into new territory. By entering into California, though, you are entering into what is at the time has just become the new independent country of Mexico. Does that make sense? Okay. Mexico gains its independence from Spain in 1845. Don't quote me on that, but I believe it's 1845. Okay. And so we're just starting to see that. But it is very difficult. Most of the travelers are men. It's about a 2 to 1, between 2 to 1 to 10 to 1. And most of them, although they reach their destination, very few of them strike it rich. However, though, because the ratio is so much more favored on the men's side than on the women's side, women being in the West, it gives them a lot more opportunity and economic as well as political freedom in the West than they would have had in the East. That political freedom and opportunity ultimately will lead to women in the Western states getting the right to vote before women in the Eastern states getting the right to vote. In fact, the first state to grant women the right to vote is Wyoming, yes. great state, Wyoming, okay? But also women have greater economic opportunity. You may not see it as an economic opportunity in our society today, but women were actually able to own their own businesses, predominantly by owning and operating brothels. But this creates actually a great amount of power and security for women in the West, where they weren't reliant on men. But that trail, as I said, is difficult. One of the parties it's probably most difficult for, or most well known that it is difficult for them, is for the Donner Party. Now this comes from a legacy project from students from a couple years ago, 3 years ago, I think.
May 11, 1846. Dear Eliza, it is supposed there be 7,000 wagons start from this place. This season we go to California, to the Bay of Francisco. It is a 4-month trip. We have 3 wagons furnished with food and clothing, etc., drawn by 3 yoke of oxen each. We take cows along and milk them, and add some butter, though not as much as we would like. I am willing to go, and have no doubt it will be an advantage to our children and to us. Your sister, Tamsen Donner.
All things are recurring amongst us. Antoine went missing the other day, and Kesselberg says he don't know where he at. We are running low on food, having all the livestock gone. Some men are contemplating on doing the unmentionable.
This is going against copyright laws. What? What? Run off? Okay.
What? Oh.
actually no definitive evidence that the Donners resorted to cannibalism, although there is some slight mentions of it in their diaries. They did resort to eating like the canvas and the leather from the wagons themselves. They also, one of the problems was when the cattle actually died, there was a snowstorm that came in, so it buried a lot of the cattle, and so they couldn't get down to dig them up to be able to eat the cattle. So it was really kind of just a everything that could have gone wrong went wrong for the Donners. But the reality of it is they probably wouldn't have survived had they not resorted to cannibalism. So we're kind of left with this did they, didn't they kind of thing.
Well, if you're getting some canvas.
More than just, yeah, well, if you're starving, you'll eat anything. More than just settlers that went west. Others went west as well. In 1847, the Mormons moved west as well. Joseph Smith believed that God spoke to him and told him that Mormons were the only true Christians. And being imprisoned, Joseph Smith had been imprisoned in Nauvoo, Illinois, where a mob shoots him as he tries to escape from the mob that was coming to hang him. As a result, Brigham Young, who will take over leadership in the Mormon Church, says that they need to leave in order to find their new Zion, or their new kind of homeland. So they actually leave the United States. Utah is outside of the United States. It's actually part of Mexico at the time, and begin that migration westward. When they reach Utah, it is not until they reach Utah that the Mormon Church will actually begin to practice polygamy, so they're not really practicing it before. But Brigham Young himself will have 55 marriages, some of which were just called spiritual marriages, so he wasn't actually like having sexual intercourse with all 55 of these women.
Some of them you only saw for like a day or two.
Yeah. And not all of them, not all of the people that were Mormon at the time were polygamous, but some were. Brigham Young, though, I always think that this is interesting. Historically, when he gets to that area, Brigham Young's suffering from tick fever, and so he's a little delirious. And if you've ever been to Salt Lake City, you kind of understand like why, like it's a little odd for him to be like, this is our Zion. So he gets to that region, and it's literally like a desert with the exception of the lake, but the lake is salt water, so you know there's that. And he gets to the area and he's like, this shall be our new Zion. And it's like, are you saying that because you're delirious from tick fever, or did you actually like truly believe like it was going to be like the new place for you? But I guess in a way it worked out for the Mormon people, because Utah literally has become like the haven of the Mormon Church. So maybe he was accurate in it. But unfortunately for him, there's a lot of conflict, and unfortunately for the Mormons, there's still a lot of conflict between the United States and the Mormon Church. In 1857, the Mormon and Church and U.S. government basically go to war with each other in Utah, and there's a lot of conflict as a result of that. So I understand that them moving out there to try to escape kind of the conflict and the oppression that they faced in Illinois, unfortunately, it just kind of follows with them there as well. In addition to the conflict that the Mormons will face, there's also conflict in Texas. Now, Texas and that territory, as a result of the Adams-Onis Treaty, in which the United States got Florida and we gave up our claim to Texas, that land belonged to Spain and then subsequently belonged to Mexico when they got their independence. But Americans had been moving into the Tejano region of Texas. That's why Texas is called Texas, because the Tejano people of Mexico lived in that region. Kind of makes sense, right? But Americans have been moving into this area and moving into this territory. But in order to move into that territory, they were leaving the United States and moving into Mexico. So the Mexican government made it, or the Spanish government first, and then the Mexican government subsequently made it very clear that if Americans moved into that territory, they were not allowed to bring their slaves with them. In addition to not bringing their slaves with them, they had to convert to Catholicism. They could no longer continue to practice Protestant faith. However, as Americans,
We protest.
We don't listen.
we didn't listen, and we did both. We brought our slaves with us, and we did not convert to Protestant faith whatsoever at all. And so conflict continued in this region. In 18... Oops, sorry, I hate that. I need to get rid of those. I don't know why I thought that was a brilliant idea at one point in time. I guess wake you guys up. In 1823, though, an independent Mexico was largely looking to re-secure the those rules and those policies of Mexican or no slaves, etc. And so they went to a guy by the name of Stephen Austin, who was basically the agent between the United States and the Americans living in Texas and those settlers. And they told Austin that he could continue to allow people to come in, but that not a lot of people were allowed to come in. However, by 1835, the Americans living in the Texas area is about 30,000 Americans, which means they outnumbered the Tejano people by 6 to 1. In 35 then, the new president of Mexico, a guy by the name of Santa Anna, which we'll talk about later, but he's literally one of my favorite dudes in history. For starters, Santa Anna's full name is Antonio de Puada Maria Severino de Lopez de Santa Ana y Perez de la Bron. Yeah. It's literally like 15 names long. It's sweet, okay? He also carries around his leg for like a week and a half and builds a memorial to it, but we'll talk about him and his leg tomorrow probably. But anyways, Santa Anna wants to get Americans out of that region because of their failure to follow the rules and follow the law. And
Wait, what was his name?
Santa Anna is what we just call him. It's a lot longer than that, but Santa Anna. Okay? And so he begins to outlaw some of these local rights. And so both the Americans and the Tejano people decide that they no longer want to live under the rule of Santa Anna, who has abolished these constitutional rights of the Mexican people. And so in 1836, they declare their independence. Okay? And they name their president Sam Houston. Hence why Texas has Houston and Austin, Texas, right? Because they're two of the biggest Americans who lead to the formation of Texas. But they make Sam Houston as their president. In less than 7 months, then, Santa Anna will send in an army of about 6,000 men and soldiers to put down their rebellion as he sees it. This battle is known as the first one is the Battle of San Jacinto. It's not super important in the big scheme of American history, but if you're in Texas, these two things are really, 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 really important to you. And because Texas buys the most amount of textbooks, generally find you a large section on the Alamo in the textbook because of that.
Isn't like Texas history like mandatory like all throughout high school or something?
Yeah. Texas is really, really big on
They love themselves.
the fact that they're Texas. Okay.
The fact that they're
But Sam Houston will lead this Texas army and will get a victory in a mere 18 minutes at the Battle of San Jacinto. They kill and or capture about 730 and only 9 Texans will die in the battle. But Santa Anna looks at, and although Santa Anna is captured shortly after the battle and held as a POW, he will be forced as a result of that to sign a peace treaty giving Texas its independence. However, Santa Anna is not done, and Santa Anna then will send an additional set of troops in at the Alamo. At the Alamo, 187 Americans die, which includes 2 of the leaders at the Alamo, a guy by the name of Davy Crockett, you know, the coon, like raccoon hat dude, and a guy by the name of James Bowie. So if you've ever heard of a Bowie knife,
Yeah.
that's where that guy comes from, okay? As a result of the Alamo and the catastrophe at the Alamo, in which there were 5,000 of Santa Anna's men against a mere 200 Americans, and the Alamo is a mission, so it's a church, although we were using it as a military base, but shh, don't tell anybody. We see Sam Houston decide to send his army and his forces after Santa Anna, and to try to go after Santa Anna to basically to ensure Texas would gain their independence. In less than 7 months, Texas ultimately is able to gain its independence from Santa Anna, according to the Texas people, and according to Sam Austin, and according to Austin and Houston. But unfortunately, Mexico does not actually recognize them as being independent. The next question becomes, what?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, that sounds familiar, right? Okay, so they're not actually being recognized as being an independent nation. The next question becomes, what do we do with Texas? The people of Texas wanted to become a part of the United States. They wanted to be annexed. But the problem with Texas is if we recognize Texas and bring Texas in, Texas would probably come in as a slave state. Not only do they already have slaves there, but if we're going by the Missouri Compromise, okay, 1820, it is below the 36-30 line, and so therefore it will come in as a slave state. Does that make sense? But if it comes in as a slave state, it will upset the balance between slave and free. And so ultimately, as a direct result of that, Martin Van Buren refuses to recognize Texas as a state. Texas then will go on to become an independent nation for approximately 9 years. This is why Texans like to say that they are the only state to have flown under 3 different flags, because they're under the Republic of Mexico, and then as their own independent country, and then part of the United States.
What's so good about Texas?
It's just Texas.
Well,
That's just how
what's
they are.
there? Like, everything's
nothing.
bigger in Texas.
Yeah, everything's bigger in Texas.
Their self-confidence is what really
Yeah.
Texas is.
But Mexico, as a result of this tension that exists in there, although Mexico, they claim they're independent, Mexico never recognizes the independence of Texas. And they argue under Van Buren that if he decides to annex Texas, they will declare war on the United States for basically stealing Texas from Mexico.
But didn't they sign a treaty saying they recognize
Eventually. Not yet.
the battle sand?
Yeah, and then Santa Anna repeals it. Okay.
How is Santa Anna?
He says the only reason I signed that treaty to recognize them as independent is because of the fact that I was a POW, and the only way they would release me is if I signed this treaty. So I signed it under duress. Does that make sense? So he's saying they are not a legitimate country. I just did it so I could be free.
How is Santa Anna one of your favorite?
Oh, you'll just wait till tomorrow. You'll
Cut
know.
his leg off and carried around for 15 days.
Yeah, just wait. I mean, there's a great story with his leg. Ultimately, what to do with Texas becomes one of the biggest issues in the election of 1844, and a leading campaign issue. And although Henry Clay will lose to Polk, Polk very much pushes this idea of manifest destiny, and Polk also pushes the idea of American expansionism. He is our first president to really argue that America should expand no matter what. In fact, his campaign slogan is 54-40 or fight. In other words, and what Polk actually wants to do is he wants to go farther north into Canada, to take that territory around the Columbian River where there are 5,000 Americans living versus the 700 British living there. He does not plan on going to war with Mexico, although he will wind up having to deal with Mexico, largely because his predecessor, John Tyler, who, remember, Tyler takes over after Harrison dies, and Tyler, quite frankly, doesn't really do anything as a president of the United States. And so on his way out, while he is the lame duck president, what's a lame duck president? No.
It usually means that the house is controlled by the opposite party. So
No.
Unlike all these presidents,
They're assassin
Lincoln,
presidents,
do nothing.
they're fill-ins.
No. The lame duck is the period from, so like with Obama, the period after Donald Trump was elected, but before Donald Trump Donald Trump takes office. That's the lame duck period of your presidency. Does that make sense?
Oh, you can like
You're-
do all your
And
acts.
you're basically outgoing. So anything that you do isn't going to affect your political career, but you may not be able to get anything passed because they're going to stonewall you to prevent anything from happening.
it's
Does that make
a
sense?
couple-
They,
a
like,
couple
push
months
the
that you
roll
have
with
to-
the-
Yeah, it's that couple month
You don't want
period, right, where you're in there. So Tyler, not wanting to be like a president who does absolutely nothing, Tyler annexes Texas. So that's all
Good
Tyler
news,
does is annex Texas. Does that make sense? Polk then has to deal with the fallout of that because now Polk is president of the United
He probably
States.
tripped him on
And-
the way out.
What's that?
He stuck his foot in his leg.
Yeah. Okay. Da, 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 da. Okay, so Texas enters the United States in 1945 then, so just as Polk is taking the office of the presidency. Polk is often known as a dark horse candidate because he pretty much comes out of nowhere. He is from Tennessee, and although Polk, does not have any political experience, Polk does have military experience. Our only president to date that has no political or military experience of any significance is Donald J. Trump. Okay, otherwise everybody else has some sort of military or political experience prior to the office of the presidency.
Political experience as like sitting. Like,
So you could have been a senator or even a governor or anything else like that. Does that make sense? It doesn't have to be extensive, but you had to have something. As an expansionist president, we can use the acronym COIL for Polk's presidency. The C stands for California, okay, and the acquisition of California. O is Oregon. I is an independent treasury system. And then L is he will lower the tariff. So that's kind of his presidency is COIL. He will only serve one term, and then after that term he actually retires. So he chooses not to run again. So he's kind of an interesting guy in that way. Now when he runs, he ultimately believes that we should actually fight a war over this territory here. However, his hand is forced by Tyler. We'll pick up with that tomorrow. And then we will get into Mr. Santa Anna and the Mexican-American War. And I'm telling you, this dude is not really. But he's
Even
just
though
gonna-
he's on the other side.
Yeah, he is, but I mean, he's so crazy that he's awesome.
Never had any political experience, never met any senators in New York.
Okay,
All the
I
time
know
they never